The cold clung to everything that morning. A thin mist drifted above the ground inside a British-run POW camp in northern Germany, softening the edges of the barbed wire but not its meaning. Frost coated the timber guard towers. Boots crunched along the hard, frozen earth as rows of German women stood silently in formation. Nurses, signal auxiliaries, factory workers, and civilians swept up in the collapse of the Reich. Their uniforms were mismatched now, some wearing borrowed coats, others wrapped in blankets stitched from scraps. Hunger had hollowed their faces. Exhaustion had settled into their eyes. A British supply officer set a wooden crate onto a table. The lid creaked open. Inside were small white packages, clean, sterile, ordinary to him. Utterly foreign to them. The women leaned forward, uncertain. Whispers spread through the line. Some looked confused. Others recoiled in embarrassment. A few exchanged quick, nervous glances, unsure whether these items were medical dressings, hospital bandages, or something else entirely. In that quiet moment of hesitation, two worlds collided, the structured hygiene standards of the Allied system and the deep wartime silence that had shaped how German women understood, and endured, their own bodies. And this moment is where the story begins, before expanding into the world that created it. By early 1945, Germany was unraveling faster than anyone inside it could comprehend. Cities that had once pulsed with industrial life lay in ruins. Rail lines were shattered, bridges collapsed, and entire neighborhoods burned to ash. The Wehrmacht was retreating in fragments, and the Nazi state, once rigid, disciplined, and all-controlling, was collapsing under the weight of relentless Allied pressure. Amid this disintegration, tens of thousands of German women found themselves swept into captivity. They came from every corner of the war effort. There were the Helferinnen, the Wehrmacht's female auxiliaries who had worked in communications, clerical duties, and logistics. There were Red Cross nurses who had served in field hospitals, often working through sleepless nights beside wounded soldiers. There were Flakhelferinnen, the anti-aircraft auxiliaries trained to operate searchlights, rangefinders, and communication posts during air raids. And there were civilians, secretaries, camp workers, wives, mothers, and refugees, caught on the roads as they fled westward to escape the advancing Eastern Front. For many, surrender was not a clear moment but a gradual collapse. Food ran out. Housing vanished. Families were scattered along highways clogged with carts, bicycles, and exhausted bodies moving in every direction. Women walked for miles on blistered feet, clutching the last pieces of their lives in small bundles. Hunger gnawed constantly. Water was uncertain. Fear was constant. Captivity, in many cases, was simply the next step in a chain of chaos. Yet hidden beneath the larger ruin was another, more intimate struggle. In Nazi-era society, menstruation sat behind a curtain of cultural silence. Mothers whispered guidance to daughters. Schools rarely addressed it. Public discussion was almost non-existent. Most women relied on reusable rags, washed privately when water was available. There were no mass-produced disposable products for civilians. Wartime shortages made even simple cloth hard to come by. Many resorted to shredding old garments or using whatever fabric they could salvage. By 1945, hygiene had deteriorated dangerously. Fleeing for days or weeks meant women often had nothing but improvised cloths, poorly cleaned and reused under unsanitary conditions. Infections were common. Pain was ignored. Shame kept them silent. So when Allied forces finally took control, the transition from collapse to captivity felt like stepping from chaos into an unfamiliar, structured world, a world that enforced sanitary routines and medical checks, where strangers inspected their belongings, their health, even their bodies. For women already stripped of home, stability, and dignity, this sudden scrutiny was overwhelming. The stage was set for a moment that would reveal just how wide the cultural gulf truly was, a moment made of something as small and ordinary as a white sanitary pad, yet large enough to expose an entire world of difference. When German women entered British and American-controlled POW camps in 1945, they stepped into a system built on order, documentation, and routine. The Allies, prepared to manage hundreds of thousands of prisoners across Europe, implemented strict procedures that felt jarringly different from the collapse the women had just escaped. The first stage was screening. Names were recorded, ages noted, roles identified. Nurses, auxiliaries, civilians, and suspected party members were separated for questioning. For many women, it was the first time anyone in authority had looked at them without anger or fear. But it was also disorienting. This was not the chaotic world they had known for months. It was structured, procedural, unyielding. Next came registration and health inspections. Allied medical personnel examined every new arrival for lice, scabies, infections, and malnutrition. Clothing was often infested. Hair was matted. Hands were cracked and swollen from cold and exhaustion. The inspections were clinical and necessary, but to women raised in cultures of modesty and silence, the process was humiliating. Some had never undergone a medical examination by a male doctor. Others were terrified of saying anything that might be misunderstood. Hygiene forms became a critical part of camp life. British and American officers implemented routines, washing stations, delousing facilities, scheduled bathing, and medical follow-ups. To the Allies, this was the minimum standard needed to prevent disease outbreaks in densely populated camps. But to the women, who had lived for months without regular water, soap, or privacy, these procedures were both a relief and a shock. It was during these inspections that Allied medical teams made a surprising observation. Many German women had no experience with disposable sanitary products. Some didn't know what they were. Others confused them with medical bandages. A few believed they were meant for wounds sustained during wartime flight. Reports from British camps noted repeated moments of confusion during distribution. Women whispered among themselves, unsure whether to ask questions. Allied nurses, used to straightforward discussions about hygiene, were unprepared for the depth of embarrassment and silence they encountered. Attempts to explain usage became delicate exercises in cross-cultural communication. The cultural divide was stark. Allied nations had introduced commercial sanitary pads decades earlier. Advertisements, basic education, and hospital training had normalized their use. But in Germany, especially during the war, production and distribution of such products were minimal. Cloth was rationed. Manufacturing focused on uniforms, bandages, and military needs. Civilian women adapted as best they could, often without support or guidance. As the camp routine settled, the Allied staff realized they needed to address this gap directly. Supplies had arrived. The women needed them. But first, someone had to find a way to bridge the silence, the shame, and the unfamiliarity. And that is where the next layer of the story begins, the human, medical, and logistical angles that shaped this extraordinary moment. Human angle. For the women in the camp, the moment sanitary supplies were handed out was not merely a matter of receiving a practical item. It was an abrupt confrontation with a subject they had been taught never to speak about. In many German homes of the early 20th century, menstruation was concealed behind silence. Mothers whispered advice only when necessary. Schools avoided the topic entirely. When the women in captivity saw the small white packages, their first instinct was to avert their eyes, to hide their hands, to avoid showing curiosity. The fear of appearing ignorant lingered beneath their reactions. They worried about being judged, laughed at, or misunderstood by Allied staff. Shame sat as heavily as hunger. Even simple questions felt impossible to ask. This deeply rooted social conditioning shaped every expression, every hesitation, and every whisper that passed through the line that morning. Medical angle. From the perspective of Allied nurses, the situation unfolding before them was both expected and alarming. When female POWs arrived, many were suffering from infections, irritation, or complications linked to prolonged use of makeshift cloths. Some had gone weeks without proper washing facilities during their flight from the Eastern Front. Others wore the same improvised rags for days because clean fabric was impossible to obtain in the final months of the war. To the medical teams, disposable sanitary pads were not luxuries, they were essential tools to prevent outbreaks of illness in crowded camps. Yet the moment they distributed these supplies, they were met with confusion rather than relief. Nurses realized they had to bridge a gap they had not anticipated, not only providing the items but explaining them, gently and respectfully, to women who came from a system where hygiene education was almost entirely absent. Logistical angle. Behind the scenes, the Allied supply system represented a logistical feat shaped by rationing, transportation limits, and the massive scale of post-war humanitarian responsibilities. Every POW camp required predictable inventories: food, medical kits, clothing, blankets, and sanitation materials. For female prisoners, this list included menstrual supplies. Allied procurement officers sourced these products through civilian manufacturers in Britain and the United States, where sanitary pads had been available since the early 20th century. Though wartime rationing had restricted many consumer goods, sanitary products were still obtainable in quantities sufficient for military and POW administration needs. Moving these supplies across war-torn Europe required guarded convoys and strict record-keeping. When crates arrived at the camps, quartermasters distributed them according to standardized health protocols. To the Allies, the items were routine entries in supply ledgers. To the German women receiving them, they were objects without context, and that gap defined what happened next. Psychological angle. The sense of psychological dislocation among the women was profound. Months of flight, hunger, and loss had already stripped away familiar markers of identity. Uniforms no longer matched, ranks no longer mattered, and personal dignity had been eroded by exhaustion. Receiving an unfamiliar sanitary product in front of peers and foreign guards pushed them further into a state of vulnerability. Some felt as if they were being exposed, their ignorance laid bare. Others associated the moment with a deeper collapse of control over their lives. Captivity had reduced their world to routines imposed by others. Now, even the most private aspect of womanhood was being handled by outside authority. The shock was not merely about the item itself, but about what it represented, a reminder that the war had taken everything, even the privacy of their own bodies. This internal rupture shaped their reactions more than the physical object ever could. Cultural angle. German culture in the early 20th century approached menstruation with restraint and silence. Many young women grew up with only fragmentary explanations passed down by their mothers, often framed as a private duty rather than a topic for open discussion. Advertisements for feminine hygiene products existed in pre-war Germany, but they were limited, expensive, and unavailable to most households even before rationing. Wartime shortages further restricted access, forcing women to improvise with cloth scraps, worn-out garments, or whatever fabric they could save. The idea of a disposable pad, pre-shaped, absorbent, meant to be thrown away, was outside the practical and cultural experience of most. As refugees and auxiliaries entered Allied custody, they carried with them not just physical fatigue but the weight of a lifetime of unspoken rules. Those rules unraveled the moment an Allied nurse held up a sanitary pad and explained its purpose. Enemy angle. For Allied officers observing the women's reactions, the scene revealed an unexpected cultural divide. Many had assumed that sanitary knowledge would be universal among European women. Reports and letters from medical units note initial bewilderment at the women's refusal or hesitation to use the supplies. Some officers misinterpreted the reactions as stubbornness or distrust, not realizing the depth of taboo that shaped the women's silence. Others recognized the humanitarian importance of the moment and encouraged nurses to provide patient explanations. Documentation from certain camps mentions repeated attempts to teach usage through quiet demonstrations or detailed verbal instructions. To the Allies, the sanitary pads symbolized hygiene and modernity. To the German women, they were reminders of everything they had never been taught. This misalignment of assumptions set the stage for a turning point, the first true moment of understanding between prisoners and their captors. Enemy angle. For Allied officers observing the women's reactions, the scene revealed an unexpected cultural divide. Many had assumed that sanitary knowledge would be universal among European women. Reports and letters from medical units note initial bewilderment at the women's refusal or hesitation to use the supplies. Some officers misinterpreted the reactions as stubbornness or distrust, not realizing the depth of taboo that shaped the women's silence. Others recognized the humanitarian importance of the moment and encouraged nurses to provide patient explanations. Documentation from certain camps mentions repeated attempts to teach usage through quiet demonstrations or detailed verbal instructions. To the Allies, the sanitary pads symbolized hygiene and modernity. To the German women, they were reminders of everything they had never been taught. This misalignment of assumptions set the stage for a turning point, the first true moment of understanding between prisoners and their captors. The distribution began with the same routine that governed every aspect of POW camp life: a table, a ledger, a supply crate, and a line of weary women waiting for their names to be called. But as the supply officer lifted the lid and exposed the neatly stacked white pads, the atmosphere shifted. The women stiffened. Their eyes lingered on the unfamiliar objects with a mixture of suspicion and embarrassment. A few stepped forward, only to pause, uncertain whether to reach out or keep their hands at their sides. Whispers fluttered through the line like a draft of cold air. What are they? Are they for wounds? Bandages, maybe? Most were too embarrassed to ask aloud, their voices betraying a lifetime of being taught that menstruation was something hidden, never mentioned outside the home. An Allied nurse, sensing the rising confusion, stepped closer and held up one of the pads. She tried to explain its purpose in slow, careful English, repeating the gesture of how it was meant to be used. But the women stared back blankly, unable to bridge the gap between the demonstration and what little they understood. Some nodded politely out of habit, concealing their discomfort behind silence. A handful of women recoiled. One shook her head firmly, pushing the package away as though it might reveal something shameful about her. Another clutched the item but held it against her chest like an unopened letter she had no intention of reading. For some, the unfamiliarity sparked fear of doing something wrong, fear of drawing unwanted attention, fear of violating an unspoken rule from home. A few of the older women whispered among themselves, trying to deduce its purpose. One compared it to field dressings she had seen during air raids. Another noted the cotton texture and wondered if it was meant to be worn inside clothing for warmth. None of the guesses came close. Standing a few steps away, a British medical officer observed the unfolding scene with quiet astonishment. He scribbled in his small notebook, noting the hesitation, the confusion, the looks of embarrassment that passed like shadows over the women's faces. His reports would later describe how the lack of sanitary education in Germany had created a barrier far deeper than the wire fences surrounding the camp. This, he wrote, was a moment that revealed the intimate consequences of wartime scarcity and cultural silence. And as the women eventually dispersed, clutching their unrecognized supplies, it became clear that this small act, this simple distribution, had become the point where two worlds collided in full view. The first day ended with more confusion than clarity, but by the second morning, something had begun to shift. The women still approached the supply table with caution, yet the sharp embarrassment of the previous day had softened into a quiet determination to understand. Survival had already forced them to adapt to hunger, cold, and captivity. Now it pushed them to confront this unfamiliar aspect of their own biology. It began in small clusters. Inside one of the barracks, an older Red Cross nurse, who had encountered disposable pads only once in a Berlin hospital years earlier, opened her package carefully, studying the shape and stitching. Two younger auxiliaries watched her closely. She spoke in low tones, explaining what she remembered, showing them how the pad was meant to be placed and secured. Her explanation was imperfect, but it was enough to break the silence. Soon, other women gathered around, each bringing their own fragments of understanding or uncertainty. In another hut, a British nurse entered quietly, aware of the vulnerability of the moment. She carried a piece of cloth and gestured gently, demonstrating the basic method without speaking at length. Words were difficult, gestures were easier. The women nodded, hesitated, then slowly began to imitate the motion. For many of them, this was the first time anyone had openly explained menstrual hygiene in a structured, uninhibited way. The discomfort remained, but curiosity overcame shame. Once the women understood the purpose, the relief was immediate. The constant struggle of washing improvised rags in cold water, often without soap, had taken a toll on their health. Allied medical records from several camps noted a decline in infections within weeks of introducing disposable supplies. Skin irritation lessened. Cases of inflammation dropped. Women who had suffered in silence throughout months of flight and displacement finally found a measure of physical comfort. Comparative reports from different British-run camps echoed the same progression: initial confusion, cultural resistance, gradual acceptance, and eventual appreciation. In one camp, American nurses noted that the youngest detainees adapted the fastest, unburdened by decades of taboo. Older women, shaped by pre-war modesty, took longer, but many eventually embraced the practicality once they saw the health benefits. Moments of humanity emerged quietly between the routines of captivity. A young auxiliary shyly offered her remaining cloth rags to another woman for warmth, no longer needing them. A British nurse helped a pregnant detainee manage her hygiene with extra supplies, treating her with a tenderness that surprised them both. Groups of women washed together more confidently, no longer hiding their belongings under blankets. The sanitary pads, trivial objects in the eyes of the supply officers, became small symbols of recovery, bridging a cultural divide through necessity and shared vulnerability. As the camp settled into this new normal, the women's adaptation marked the turning point where humiliation gave way to understanding, and where silent suffering began to ease. And with that shift came the broader consequences, emotional, medical, and social, that shaped the aftermath of this encounter. The changes were not immediate, but they were undeniable. Within days of receiving proper menstrual hygiene supplies and learning how to use them, many of the German women in captivity began to experience the first sense of physical relief they had felt in months. The crude rags, old shirts, and scraps of linen they had previously relied upon were finally being replaced by clean, absorbent materials. This shift alone reduced the constant chafing, irritation, and foul odors that had made their daily existence even more degrading. For the first time, some of them were able to walk without discomfort, sit without wincing, or sleep without waking to dried blood stiffening their makeshift cloths. Medical officers across several Allied-run camps noted a visible decrease in urinary tract infections and skin inflammations. Where before they had treated a nearly endless line of women suffering from persistent rashes, bacterial infections, and feverish complications, the complaints began to lighten. One British nurse wrote in her daily report that she could finally see the women breathe, as if the simple offering of hygiene supplies had lifted an invisible but crushing burden from their shoulders. The camp administration took notice. What had begun as a small-scale, almost improvised intervention, initiated by a handful of sympathetic nurses, soon evolved into a formal protocol. Sanitary supplies were added to the medical inventory lists. Monthly distributions were scheduled. A discreet instruction sheet, handwritten by an American nurse and copied dozens of times, circulated quietly from barrack to barrack. Commanders, though often distant from the day-to-day struggles of the women, eventually approved these measures once the medical benefits became indisputable. Emotionally, the shift was more complicated. Some women felt genuine gratitude, relief that someone had recognized their suffering, even if only in this small, intimate way. Others felt shame for needing help from their captors, fearing it made them appear weak or dependent. A few remained guarded, convinced that these gestures were temporary or carried hidden motives. But beneath these layers of emotion lay a shared, unspoken acknowledgement: their dignity, long eroded by hunger, captivity, and uncertainty, had been partially restored. A subtle change swept through the barracks. Conversations during nighttime roll call grew softer, less tense. Younger women, previously terrified during their first post-capture periods, now had guidance and reassurance. Mothers experienced fewer complications. Even arguments diminished. The atmosphere was still bleak, war had not ended, captivity had not loosened, but the women carried themselves with just a bit more steadiness. The aftermath of that turning point was not grand, dramatic, or loud. It was quiet, intimate, and deeply human, felt in small, private moments where relief replaced pain, understanding replaced confusion, and dignity began, slowly, to return. For many of the German women, the lessons learned in captivity remained etched in memory long after the war ended. Diaries, letters, and oral histories collected in the decades following 1945 reveal recurring reflections on those small, white packages. Some described them as strange gifts that initially caused embarrassment, but later came to symbolize care, order, and a moment of human kindness amid the chaos of defeat. One former Flakelferin recounted in an interview how she first thought the pads were bandages, and how an older inmate quietly demonstrated their use. A private act of mentorship that she remembered vividly even 50 years later. These personal accounts also illuminate the stark contrast between wartime Germany and the post-war world. In occupied zones, Allied influence extended beyond military control into basic hygiene education. Women returning to civilian life found themselves with knowledge and habits previously denied. Schools and public health campaigns began to introduce formal instruction on menstruation, reflecting a broader transformation in women's health across Germany. The scarcity and secrecy that had dominated the war years gave way to education, accessibility, and normalization. The narratives reveal more than practical change; they expose the cultural and psychological toll of wartime silence. Many women admitted that their initial shame stemmed not from the items themselves, but from decades of learned secrecy, fear of judgment, and internalized modesty. The war had amplified these pressures, leaving them unprepared for the very existence of sanitary products. In this light, the Allied intervention was more than a medical or logistical necessity; it was a confrontation with deeply rooted social taboos, and a first step toward breaking them. Post-war reflections also highlight the human connections forged in captivity. Older women mentoring younger detainees, Allied nurses guiding hesitant prisoners, and shared moments of quiet instruction became memories of trust and subtle care in an otherwise harsh environment. These experiences informed the women's future attitudes toward hygiene, parenting, and education, creating a ripple effect that influenced families and communities long after the camp fences had disappeared. Ultimately, the story of German women encountering sanitary supplies in POW camps reveals the intricate interplay between war, culture, and human dignity. A seemingly small intervention, clean pads and instructions on how to use them, bridged gaps of knowledge, eased suffering, and reshaped post-war societal norms. It underscores how even the most basic aspects of human biology can become battlegrounds for survival, education, and the restoration of self-respect in the aftermath of conflict. In the cold barracks of a northern German POW camp, a small white package held more than cotton and absorbent material. It held a lesson in humanity. For a moment, the war, with its endless destruction, death, and dislocation, receded into the background, and the simplest act of care revealed the profound cost of conflict. This moment underscores how war does not only shatter cities or erase armies, it infiltrates the most private corners of human life. Cultural silence, centuries of social taboos, and wartime scarcity converge to make something as ordinary as menstrual hygiene a source of fear, confusion, and humiliation. In this narrow intersection of biology, tradition, and deprivation, dignity itself became a battlefield. The women's struggle was invisible on maps and absent from strategy meetings, yet it was as real as any front line, and as urgent as any medical emergency. The story reminds us that history is composed not only of generals and weapons but also of daily human survival, of quiet interventions, and of gestures that restore agency and self-respect. It reveals the resilience of individuals faced with unfamiliarity and shame, and the power of education, empathy, and patience to rebuild a sense of control. In the stillness of those barracks, the distribution of a simple supply became a symbol of care, humanity, and subtle resistance against the erasure of personal dignity. It is a story that fades quietly, but its echoes persist, a testament to the small, often overlooked acts that define what it means to survive, to learn, and to be human.